Here is the script rewritten in a unique, copyright-free, voice-over-ready style. All names, locations, dialogue, and specific details have been changed to create a fresh, original version while preserving the complete emotional arc and length of the original. There is a number I want you to hold in your mind while I tell you this story. 94. 94 missed calls on a mobile phone screen, stacking up like interest on a debt. All from a man who couldn't bring himself to miss a single day of a vacation he'd planned for months. I watched that number climb from a hospital bed in Nashville, Tennessee, on a wet Wednesday morning in November, with 3 fractured ribs that made every breath feel like a negotiation with my own lungs. And I didn't answer a single one. Not one. I had a different kind of conversation to prepare for, and I was saving every word of it. My name is Robert Hall. I am 67 years old. I built Hall Transport from a single rented truck and a handshake deal with a local supplier in 1991 into a $12 million freight company over 32 years. I have 2 sons, one by blood and one by everything that matters. And lying in that hospital bed was the first time in nearly 30 years I stopped pretending there was no difference between them. Welcome to A Father's Truth. What you're about to hear happened to me, every detail of it. Settle in, because this story covers 3 decades of a man's quietest failures and the week he finally stopped making them. Drop a comment when you finish and subscribe if you haven't yet. You belong here. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening, 7:12 p.m. at the intersection of Union and 4th, 2 blocks from the tailor I'd been taking my suits to for 12 years. I had a green light. The delivery van running the cross street did not. 3 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and what the attending physician, a young woman who looked fresh out of residency but spoke with the calm authority of someone twice her age, described as a significantly bruised kidney. I asked her what that meant in plain English. She said my kidney was having a very difficult week. I told her it could join the club. The first call I made the next morning was to Daniel, my biological son, 42 years old. I always called Daniel first. I've spent 30 years analyzing why, and I'm no closer to an answer than I was at the start, except that it has something to do with the particular stubbornness of a father who keeps trying to prove something to a child who stopped being curious about him long ago. I dialed. He picked up on the second ring, which should have told me something right there, and I told him where I was. Room 311, St. Thomas Regional. 3 ribs, a wrist, a kidney. Come when you can. The silence on his end wasn't the concerned kind. I know Daniel's silences the way you know the sounds a house makes in winter. This one had calculation in it. Then I heard his wife, Vanessa, underneath. Low and quick, that particular tone she uses when she's working an angle and needs him to hold steady while she does. Those 2 have been married 4 years, and she still approaches every situation like she's managing a negotiation on his behalf. He said, "Dad, here's the thing. The Belize trip leaves Thursday. The resort has a policy about cancellations inside 72 hours. The deposit, Vanessa's already packed. And it's not like the doctor said you're in any danger, right?" I said his name the way I used to when he was 12, sitting across the kitchen table with a report card he'd hidden for 2 weeks. I told him to go. He exhaled. The relief in it was real, even wrapped in the thinnest possible layer of guilt. He said they'd call every day. He said Vanessa sent her regards. He said I worked too hard and should rest. He hung up before I could respond to that last part, which was perhaps the most efficient thing he'd ever done for me. There I was, Robert Hall, 67 years old, fractured wrist, bruised kidney, 3 ribs screaming every time I breathed, being informed by the man who'd received $5,500 from my checking account every single month for 8 straight years that I worked too hard. I put the phone face down on the hospital tray table and looked at the ceiling and let myself sit with exactly how long it had taken me to get here. The nurse on that floor was a woman named Carla. Broad-shouldered, originally from Mississippi, called everyone sweetheart with complete sincerity, regardless of age or circumstance, which is rarer and harder than it sounds. She came in around 8 to check my IV, took one look at my face, and asked directly whether I wanted to talk about whatever was on it or whether I wanted her to pretend she hadn't seen it. I told her neither. She adjusted the drip, made a note on her tablet, and was almost at the door when I said my son was on his way to Belize. She stopped. I said his resort had a cancellation policy. She turned around slowly and looked at me with the specific expression of a woman who's worked a hospital floor long enough to have heard everything and is still occasionally surprised by the particular ways human beings manage to disappoint each other. She said one syllable that covered the entire situation completely, turned back around, and went about her morning. I made 2 more calls before 8:30. The first was to my accountant, a precise, unsentimental man named David, who'd been managing my finances for 20 years and had never once asked a question he didn't already know the answer to. I told him to suspend the monthly transfer to Daniel's account, effective that morning, indefinitely. He asked for the amount, $5,500, I said. Done. He paused and asked if there was anything else. Not today, I told him. The second call was to a private nursing agency on Church Street. I arranged for a live-in nurse starting Thursday. Her name was Patricia. She had 18 years of experience, and her voice on the phone had the particular quality of someone who gets things handled correctly and doesn't need to make a production of it. Those 2 calls, each under 4 minutes, were going to change more than I understood at the time. Marcus showed up at 4:18 that afternoon. I know the precise time because I'd been watching the clock the way you do when lying still is your only option and your mind needs something to count. The door opened and there he was. No call ahead, no announcement. Still wearing the work jacket from the freight yard out in Antioch, where he'd been since 6 that morning. A crease on his left cheek from the hard hat he wore on the floor. He looked at me in the bed, looked at the wrist brace, looked at the IV stand and the monitor, and the untouched cup of pudding that Carla had delivered with genuine optimism. Then he pulled the chair from the corner of the room without asking if that was acceptable, sat down, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and said 4 words. What do you need? Not, are you okay? Not, I would have come sooner if I'd known. What do you need? I've heard eulogies that moved me less than those 4 words in that moment. I asked how he'd found out. He said a woman named Mrs. Patterson on my street had called the yard. She'd seen the ambulance Tuesday night and thought someone should know. Mrs. Patterson is 76 years old, grows tomatoes in buckets on her front porch, and has the neighborhood awareness of someone who spent a career in military intelligence. I had never in my life been more grateful to her than I was in that moment. Marcus asked, without requiring me to explain anything, whether Daniel had come. I told him Daniel hadn't needed to. That was Marcus. He's never needed the full sentence. Never needed things spelled out or positioned for him. Not since he was 9 years old, sitting at my kitchen table 3 days after his mother died, eating cereal at midnight because he couldn't sleep, and looking up at me to ask in a voice that was both completely heartbroken and completely practical, "What do we do now, Uncle Robert?" Claire had been my little sister. 31 years old when an aneurysm took her, the kind that comes without warning and leaves without explanation. She'd been a single mother, no father in the picture, no family left except me. Marcus had no one. So Marcus had me, and I'd done right by him in practical terms ever since. I'd given him a home, an education, a job, and every resource I had access to. What I had not done, and what I was beginning to understand, sitting in room 311, watching missed call number 68 light up the screen on my bedside table, was acknowledge him in the ways that actually cost something. I'd never told Daniel I intended to leave Marcus anything. I'd told myself it was about keeping family peace, avoiding favoritism, not making holidays complicated. I'd believed that story long enough that it had started to feel true. It stopped feeling true that Tuesday afternoon with Marcus 3 feet away asking what I needed. He went down to the hospital cafeteria and came back with food that didn't have mushrooms in it, because he's known since he was 14 that I can't stand mushrooms and has never once needed reminding. I had to look out the window at the Nashville skyline going gray in the November dusk. 67 years old, 2 sons, 30 years of making sure the wrong one never felt overlooked, while the right one just went to find me dinner without being asked. My phone lit up again. I turned it face down and thought about a will that was 16 years old, what it said and what it didn't say, and about the considerable distance between what a man is handed and what a man earns. Thursday arrived and I'd been awake since before 5. The kidney still had opinions about existing. The ribs made breathing feel like a process requiring conscious attention. My phone had accumulated 94 missed calls overnight, and I'd answered none of them because I wasn't ready yet. Robert Hall doesn't speak until the words are going to mean something. I'd fired 19 people in 32 years of running a business, and each one received exactly the sentence they needed to hear, and not one syllable beyond it. Friday was coming. I was keeping everything I had to say for Friday. Patricia arrived at 8:15. 62 years old, silver hair, originally from Galveston. She moved through the room the way capable people move through difficult situations. No wasted motion, no announcement of herself. She shook my good hand, checked my chart, looked at me directly, and asked whether I'd slept and whether I'd eaten. Marcus had brought something the night before, I told her. She asked if Marcus was family. Yes, I said, the way I should have been saying it out loud for 20 years. She nodded like that was simply a confirmed fact and went about organizing everything that needed organizing. Within 45 minutes, she'd restructured my medication schedule, briefed 2 floor nurses on things they'd missed, and flagged a ventilation problem above my bed that the facilities department had apparently been ignoring for 7 weeks. It was repaired before noon. 8 years, $5,500 a month to Daniel. 45 minutes with Patricia, and she'd already done more useful work on my behalf than he had in a decade. I didn't linger on that thought because it had edges. Marcus came back at 11 with dark roast coffee from the place on Broadway I'd been going to since 2003. No sugar, splash of cream. He handed mine across without asking because he already knew. He'd known since he was 14, riding shotgun with me on Saturday mornings while I ran the company books. Claire had told me once that Marcus absorbed information about people the way other children absorb games, completely and permanently. She'd rarely been wrong about anything, and she was least wrong about her own son. We sat, 2 people in a room being honest about where they were, no performance attached to it. I told him I had an appointment with Arthur Morrison the following afternoon. Arthur was my estate attorney on Commerce Street. He'd been handling my affairs for 23 years and had the particular quality of a man who charges $4.50 an hour and earns every cent of it by having no unnecessary opinions. The will was 16 years old, I told Marcus. I'd written it at a time when I believed keeping the peace and keeping the family together were the same objective. I had since come to understand they were not. Marcus looked at the window. He told me I didn't owe him anything. He said what I'd done after Claire died was enough. I told him to let me finish what I'd started. He held my eyes for a long moment, then picked up his coffee and nodded once. That nod was going to cost him something too in the best possible way, but I didn't tell him that yet. Daniel called at 2. I answered because Thursday afternoon was my time, and I decided. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone, and what was underneath was tight and controlled. The voice of a man who's received information he didn't expect and is working out what it means for him. He said David had called him. I said I expected he had. He said the transfer hadn't gone through. That was correct. He started to say something about Belize and the resort and the deposit, and I told him quietly and without heat that we hadn't talked. I had listened while he explained. There was a distinction, and it mattered. He asked me to wait while he put me on speaker. I told him to go ahead. Vanessa came in sharp, said my name, asked how the resort was. I told her I knew what the warmth covered and had known for 8 years. One clean sentence, final as a door closing. I told them we would speak face to face when they returned, and I ended the call. Marcus was watching me. Not quite respect, not quite sadness. Something between the two. The look of a man watching another man set down a weight he's been carrying for an unreasonable amount of time. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was getting there. He drank his coffee and didn't push. He never pushed. He just stayed. And I'd spent enough years in hospital rooms and boardrooms and difficult conversations to know that staying is sometimes the entire thing. Friday morning, he was at the door at 7:30, exactly as he'd said he would be, in his work jacket with his keys already in his hand. He helped me into a jacket, listened to Patricia run through the care instructions without writing a single word down, and memorized every item. He signed the temporary release paperwork and walked me to the elevator the way someone walks a person they've been responsible for their entire lives, because in every way that mattered, he had been. The drive to Arthur's office on Commerce Street took us through Edgefield, where I'd raised Marcus after Claire passed. Through Midtown, where I'd built the company from that first rented truck into something real. Into downtown, where Arthur had been keeping my estate in order for 23 years. Marcus drove the way he did everything, steady and economical, no unnecessary movement, eyes forward. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. Arthur met us at the door himself. 71 years old, grey suit, the expression of a man who spent decades knowing precisely what people are worth and what they've done to deserve it. His office smelled like old paper and serious money and the particular gravity of decisions that are going to outlast everyone in the room. The 16-year-old Will was already laid flat on the conference table when we walked in, waiting. I asked Arthur if he'd reviewed my notes. He said thoroughly. I asked if he had questions. He said none. I told him I was certain, and we began. 2 hours. 19 pages. Blue ink, hall transport, 32 years of early mornings and brutal negotiations, and one rented truck that became a fleet went to Marcus. 75% controlling interest, effective upon my death or voluntary transfer, with the remaining 25% directed to a children's literacy foundation on the south side of Nashville, where Claire had volunteered in the years before she died. She used to bring Marcus on Saturday afternoons when he was small. He'd sit in the corner reading while she helped kids with their homework. It felt right. It felt exactly like her. Daniel received the lake house. 4 bedrooms, a good dock, assessed at $450,000. A fair return for a son who'd done just enough to qualify as one. And then there was the letter. 1 page, my words, not Arthur's, written Wednesday night in room 311 with my left hand, because the right was in a brace while the ventilation unit rattled above me and Nashville was quiet outside the window. Every sentence I put down cost me something real. I wasn't cruel in that letter. Cruelty would have been simple, and I've never had patience for simple. I told Daniel what 8 years of $5,500 a month had actually been. Not love, not generosity in any meaningful sense. Guilt. The guilt of a father who watched himself build a transactional relationship with his own son 1 month at a time and kept writing checks instead of having the one honest conversation that might have changed the direction of things. I told him the checks were finished. I told him I loved him completely and without condition. The specific love of a man for a child he made and raised, the kind that doesn't negotiate itself away regardless of what the child does with it. I told him that love and financial support were 2 separate things, and I was only responsible for one of them going forward, and he was grown enough to know which one. Arthur sealed the envelope himself, marked it for courier delivery to Daniel's address on Friday morning. Marcus pulled back into the hospital parking lot at 2 in the afternoon and cut the engine. I watched the side of his face in the quiet car. Claire's jaw, Claire's stillness. I made myself say it out loud. I told him what had happened in Arthur's office. He started to say my name. I told him he was getting the company. The silence that followed was the longest of the entire week. Marcus sat inside it the way he sits inside everything. Without flinching, without manufacturing a response, without performing anything he didn't actually feel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. He said it was too much. I told him it was exactly enough, and that he shouldn't argue with a man who had 3 broken ribs and limited patience for hair splitting. The real smile came then, not the almost smile from earlier in the week, but the genuine one, the one I'd seen maybe a dozen times in 35 years, always at moments that caught him off guard. It lasted 4 seconds, and then it was back behind the composure he wore like a second skin. He said Claire would have had something to say about this. I told him she would have cried first and then told me it was about time. We stayed in the quiet car for another minute. Then he got out, came around, helped me to my feet without making anything of it, and walked me back inside. Daniel was standing outside room 311 when we stepped off the elevator. Travel clothes, an expensive carry-on, the particular tan of someone who's been in genuine equatorial sun for several days. The expression of a man who came home early from somewhere he very much wanted to stay and is working out how to be appropriately aggrieved about it without exposing that underneath the grievance is something that might be fear. Vanessa wasn't with him. Smart woman, Vanessa. She'd read the situation from the car and made a sensible decision. He looked at me. He looked at Marcus. He looked back at me. He said I'd changed the transfer and was changing the will. Not questions, because he already knew the answers. Information moves fast in this city, and it always has. I told him the details would be with Arthur Morrison Friday morning, and there was a letter he should read before he called anyone or did anything else. He said, "Dad." I said, "Daniel." I held his eyes and kept my voice the way I kept it in every negotiation that actually mattered. Flat and quiet and completely immovable. I told him that flying home from Belize told me he already understood something had changed. What he didn't yet know was how permanent. I told him to read the letter first. Everything else could wait. Then I said what I needed to say. I told my son I loved him clean. No apology wrapped around it. No cushion to soften the landing. I told him I'd loved him every day of his life and would love him every day of whatever was left of mine, and that was not changing. I paused, the way you pause in a room when the next sentence is the one that counts. And then I told him I was finished paying for the privilege of his attention. The words landed. I watched them arrive on his face, watched the anger come first, the way anger always does, and then watched something underneath the anger that had a different shape, something rarer and less certain of itself, something that might, if he chose to give it room over the coming years, grow into something useful. He did not respond. Marcus held the door to room 311 open. I walked through. We didn't hear Daniel leave, but the corridor went quiet after a while and stayed that way. Patricia looked up from her clipboard, took the room in one look, the way sharp people do, and told me dinner was in 20 minutes. And this time, I was actually going to eat it. "Yes, Mom," I told her. I sat on the edge of the bed. Marcus took his chair. Nashville turned gold outside the window in the late November light. That particular Tennessee late afternoon gold that makes hard things look like they might have been worth something after all. Claire had loved that light. She used to stand at her kitchen window in Edgefield and watch it come in and say it made the whole city look like it was trying. My phone sat on the bedside table, screen up, silent. No buzzing, no numbers climbing. Just quiet, the clean, earned kind that comes at the end of something that needed to end. Whole Transport had a future with the right hands on it. A letter sat sealed in an office on Commerce Street. A lake house on a quiet body of water waited for a son to decide whether what he'd been given was worth more or less than what he'd thrown away. That was his calculation to make, and I had done my part of it. Marcus was going to run a $12 million company. Because that's what happens when a person spends 35 years showing up without being asked, doing the right thing in rooms where nobody is watching, and never once presenting anyone with an invoice for any of it. Not as a strategy, not in anticipation of a return. Just because it was right, and he was built that way. Claire built him that way. Some of it I'd like to think I helped with. What happens when a person lives like that is eventually what they've earned finds them. It always does. It just takes longer than it should sometimes. And the fault for that delay usually belongs to the people who were supposed to see it sooner. That fault was mine. I owned it, and I fixed it while I still could. If this story stayed with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to A Father's Truth. It means everything to us and costs you nothing. Thank you for being here.